And Michael Markl will be giving our next talk on 4D flow and MRA.
Well, thanks, Martin, and also thanks to Debbie and Paul for organizing such a wonderful meeting. And also thanks to Anthony, who was really intimately involved in organizing the meeting. I'm very impressed that he was, I don't know where you found the time to prepare that fantastic talk on top of all the other things today. So thank you so much. Just one other brief thing before we get started, and that's why I think Debbie addressed me before. I'm also the treasurer of the SMRA. So I have the difficult job that I always the one last person that has to sign off on these additional expenses. So if there's anything you're missing, like limited drink tickets, things like that, you can blame me. So that's my responsibility. But I'm also an active researcher at the Northwestern University in Chicago, and I work on 4D flow MRI, which has been kind of with me throughout my entire academic career. So I want to switch gear now and talk about this certainly not more important, but more interesting topic than the finances of the SMRA. So 4D flow, again, has been around for a long time. I'm just showing a couple of images. I'm very thankful for Bob for kind of pulling up that paper by Lars Wikström that he published in 1996, which is really kind of the first modern 4D flow paper that you can find. There's even earlier work on people suggesting 7D imaging and things like that. So we're now looking back maybe at 25 years of history of 4D flow. So it's not a new technique at all, but it's taking a long time really to become more widely available. And one of the reasons is kind of shown here. So this is an imaging I'm showing that I've made myself actually when I was still back at the University of Freiburg in Germany. It's about 15 years ago that I made this, and you can see it still looks like a 4D flow image you would make today, but if you look at it, the acquisition time at this point was probably about 15 to 20 minutes. There was limited spatial resolution. The processing, making that image probably took me anything between 3 and 10 hours or something like that at the time. There's a lot of things that have changed, and that's kind of what I want to focus on, what has happened, where the field is going, where, at least in my biased opinion, the field is going and where we're at. And I want to focus on both the data acquisition side and talk about developments there, and also data analysis side, and then also try and bring it together. And one of the key developments, I think, really that was mentioned earlier also by others, is really imaging acceleration, and compressed sensing in particular has made a large difference in 4D flow. And there's now many publications out there. I'm just showing a couple of those. And you can see there image on the right that this is something that we do now routinely at Northwestern. This is a 5-minute scan, whole heart, beautiful image quality. You can see that that's substantially improved to the images shown before. A disclaimer here, this is post-Ferromoxetol, which obviously helped a lot here. So there's really been tremendous progress in shortening the acquisition time here. But one thing that you need to keep in mind with compressed sensing, there is long reconstruction times. It's a computationally intense technique. And at the same time, there is some underestimation of flow and velocities that you have to keep in mind. That's kind of a caveat of that's inherent to the CS technique. This is an example from our group where we did 2-minute 4D flow scans in the aorta, and you can see you get really neat but blunt-Altman plots when you compare conventional to accelerated 4D flow. But if you look closely, you still get an underestimation of peak velocity about 10 to 15%. So that's either something you have to live with, probably doesn't get much better than that, or you switch to another technique. And that's really where the advent of AI and deep learning comes in. There's been a lot of work recently, not only using deep learning for kind of data analysis, but for image reconstruction. And the two key advantages here really are that, number one, it may take a lot of time to train a network that's computationally intense, but once you have a trained network, the application is very quick and efficient. So recon times are much shorter, and it turns out there's a number of studies that now show that if you do that properly, then the underestimation of flow and velocity is much better. This is an example here of work from Sebastian Koserkis' group from Zurich, where they showed that with this technique, they could achieve a much faster recon time, 30 times faster, even go to higher acceleration factors, but do not really get any underestimation. This is some work from our group by one of my grad students, Haben Barhane. Actually, that's a work he presented at last year's SMI virtually, where he could show that the AI-based reconstruction, he has 2 networks here reconstructing the magnitude and the phase difference images separately, but he could show again that even with acceleration factors as high as 10, he could get shorter recon times, in particular alleviate the peak velocity underestimation. You can see this on the somewhat smallish table here on the bottom right. The red numbers is the significant differences you still get with CS, so these are biases and limits of agreement, whereas AI was able to kind of still have some difference to conventional 4D flow MRI, but none of those were significant. So it seems like that this technique lent itself to really improve on the reconstruction side. Then, of course, AI has also been applied in many ways to the data analysis. And if you think about how 4D flow MRI data is reconstructed, it's really a multi-step process. There's eddy current corrections, there is velocity anti-aliasing, there's 3D segmentation and some analysis. And all of these kind of processes can be nicely replaced by deep learning networks. This is, again, work from our group, where we kind of developed a series of networks for each task and then execute them back to back. And you can see that a standard analysis workflow that we've developed that was about 15, 20 minutes for this could be reduced to about 30 seconds with this. And keep in mind, the other thing that's an advantage here, it's fully automated, so you're kind of eliminating the interoperability that you have with these techniques. Of course, you have to build trust that you can actually see this, but you can see here, if you look at the area under the curves that were achieved compared to manual analysis, which is the ground truth, it's actually very good performance. So I'm very hopeful there that this will develop further. And this is just one example how actually accurate this can be. So this is a study, again, by Haben, one of my grad students, who you can tell has been very efficient in kind of cranking out these deep learning techniques, where he trained and tested a network that was based on 1,000 manually segmented aortas, and could show that he can really come up with a very accurate segmentation. And also, if you then look at flow quantification based on the deep learning segmented work, you can see the flow curves that are here in the dashed lines very closely match the manual analysis. And this could then even be taken further, and this is just very preliminary work, and I'd like to acknowledge the help of Kelvin Chow here from Siemens, who developed this FIRE framework, which allows you to implement reconstruction pipelines directly on the scanner. And this shows an example of a fully automated 4D flow, 3D segmentation, and then calculation of this 3D velocity MIP on scanner without any user interaction. So this could be, one of the ideas in terms of really improving workflows, that you just put everything on the scanner. And the beauty of AI here is, again, once you've trained the network, the execution locally is not that computationally intense. So I think very promising work there. More to come. Again, this is very early. But then again, you can also use AI in different ways. This is a nice example from Alistair Young Groups, who's now in London, who showed that instead of using it for image reconstruction or 3D segmentation, you use it for image enhancement. In kind of learning from high resolution computational data, how we can reduce noise on the 4D flow data and increase resolution. And you can nicely see this really if you compare these enhanced images with the original images in these boxes on the lower left here in these images. So I think there's really tremendous potential here with AI, both on the data acquisition, image reconstruction side, and on the data analysis side. So that's kind of one way to do it. You kind of take the standard techniques, they're still Cartesian for the most part, again, back to Bob's point. But then the other way to go, and that's kind of a competing methodology, and I think it will probably come together, is what Anthony just talked about, and that's these kind of 5D imaging techniques. So, and that's really kind of moving away from the paradigm of acquiring data prospectively, but really having everything free running. So I'll just walk you through here what I mean by 5D flow. So it really is, the idea is the only user interaction pretty much is you kind of place a 3D volume on the heart. You then have a free running acquisition that has some SI projection. You kind of then acquire your data, your regular 4D flow data. In this case, it's a radial acquisition. And then you take the SI projection, do a principal component analysis, and extract the respiratory and the EKG signal. And then after the scan, you take all the data and kind of bin it along the kind of EKG and respiratory direction, then use some kind of CS reconstruction, or could also be an AI in future, and then reconstruct the data after the fact. So you get really a fully 5D flow data set. 5D now stands for 3-dimensional space, time across the cardiac cycle, and time across the respiratory state. And the beauty about this data is that you can now actually slice and dice it any way you want. Like on the top row, you can say, okay, I'm just interested in the cardiac resolved images. So you just look at those. Or you can say, now I can freeze the cardiac phase and look at the respiratory motion. Or like on the lower row, you can say, I freeze both and I'll look at the 3D volume. But then you also get new information. For example, you can now look at respiratory resolved flow dynamics, which might carry important additional information. And I just want to point out that this is joint work with Matthias Stuber's group at Lausanne, and I definitely also want a shout out to Mariana Falcao here, who gave me some of those slides, in particular the last slide that beautifully kind of illustrated 5D flow MRI. We're of course not the only ones that have been working on this. This is a slide from Oliver Wieben from the group at UW-Madison. It's interesting if you look at their literature and their PC Viper technique. They've been doing 4D flow for 20 years. They just didn't call it for 5D flow. They called it PC Viper. But I just want to acknowledge that, and they've actually shown, and you can see this is an ISMM abstract from 2015. They've shown that with this technique and their respiratory gating approach, they were also able to extract quite substantial differences in cable venous flows, up to 20% during different respiratory states. Just an example from another group here around Daniel Giese, and they looked at, that's where this really becomes interesting, in patients with congenital heart disease, particular Fontan patients after repair for single ventricle physiology. And in these patients, the blood returning from the lower and the upper body, as you can see here, is routed directly to their left and right lungs. So this low pressure system that now is missing the right ventricle is very sensitive to pressure changes during respiration. And they were actually able to nicely show with this technique that if you kind of look at the Fontan connection and visualize the flow for these respiratory states, you can actually see very different flow distributions to the left and right lungs, and that's actually very important in these patients because you want to guarantee an equal distribution of flow coming from the liver to the left and right lungs. But with the traditional 4D flow techniques, you wouldn't pick that up. You would always look at data gated to end expiration. So you may actually miss some really important physiologic information. Again, this is early, but I think really interesting work moving forward, and hopefully very interesting in better understanding some of the physiologies. And then, of course, you can also quantify it. This just shows here, if you compare controls and these patients, there are substantial differences that probably play a role in the kind of outcomes in these patients. But these are studies that, of course, have to show. And then some work that I personally find interesting that we've started recently is you could use the fifth dimension, not for respiration, but for RR interval duration in patients in arrhythmia. So I find this interesting because obviously if you want to do 4D flow or 5D flow in arrhythmia, you're averaging over many cardiac cycles, and then you don't even know what that averaging effect does to your data. So in this case, we're just use this to kind of collect a histogram of the R interval durations, then bin it to short, medium, and long durations, and then you can see here, we will look at left atrial flow dynamics. These are left atrial stasis maps, and the idea is that left atrial stasis, the more blood stasis you have, a sluggish flow, the more likely is that there's a thrombus that form, and this could be an indication of risk for stroke in patients with atrial fibrillation. And what you can see here is that there are indeed differences between the short and the long arrhythmic heartbeats in these patients that we might completely miss. So I think also just an example how by these fifth and sixth dimensions you can get more information about physiology. Still not more studies and work to be done to see how useful this is in real patients. So this brings me to the end. So I hope this quick run through showed you there has been tremendous progress in 4D flow MRI, but there's still lots of work to do. There's a number of things I really haven't had a chance to tack on. Particularly, I didn't talk about Farahim, which might be a game changer in 4D flow. And then there's so many, the whole area of new advanced hemodynamic analysis techniques would be an entire different talk to cover all those. So I apologize for anything that I've left out. Last thing to do is just want to kind of thank my team and everybody involved in this research and acknowledge our funding. And last but not least, in addition to my role at SMRA, I'm also deeply involved in SCMR, which is one of our sister societies. So I'm hoping that I will see everybody back at the West Coast in January next year for the SCMR meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.